This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
And so I think suffering works that way in our Christian lives, where as we're stretched, as we're challenged, as we face difficulties, which none of us really want to face, the Lord uses them to cause us to grow. Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I am Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you doing?
Jonathan, I'm very well. Really excited about the author we get to interview today because you are that author. We're discussing a piece that you wrote in May of 24 for TableTalk Magazine called Suffering Matters. I find this really helpful. It's brief, it's to the point, it's biblically based, but it does say a few maybe counterintuitive things. Jonathan, I just want to jump right in with a question. Does suffering have a role to play in our growth? And here's a little bit of the context of why I ask it that way, because it seems like suffering stunts our growth. Suffering's what gets in the way of progress. It holds us back. So how is it that suffering could actually be something good for us?
It's one of the things that you can't miss when you come to the scriptures, that suffering is actually something that is one of the definitive characteristics of spiritual growth. It actually is something in the Bible that is, in a sense, when you respond to it rightly, it's almost guaranteed growth, which is why James can say what seem to be almost extravagant things about counting it great joy when you encounter sufferings of many kinds, because we know that kind of testing helps us in so many ways. So what I would say is this: suffering is absolutely essential to the Christian life, and it is one of the primary means. I would go so far as to say, biblically speaking, it is one of the primary means that the Lord uses to cause us to grow. And if you think about it from an athletics standpoint, there are other analogies we could use. We could talk about study or academic pursuits or whatever. But let's think about athletics for a minute. We all know that in order to get faster, stronger, gain greater endurance, what's the path to getting there? The path is suffering, struggling, stretching ourselves. I remember when I was in high school, I had the experience of having two different coaches, one year and then one the following year. And the coach I had first was more or less let us do whatever we wanted. We didn't practice hard. We just had a good time. And the second one was the opposite. We practiced really hard. He worked us really hard. And of course, exactly what you'd expect to happen happened, which was we were a better team under the coach who pushed us harder. And so I think suffering works that way in our Christian lives, where as we're stretched, as we're challenged, as we face difficulties, which none of us really want to face, the Lord uses them to cause us to grow.
Is there a difference between suffering and punishment? I think sometimes people, I ask that because sometimes I think people elide those in their minds, that if I'm suffering, what crime have I done, so to speak?
Right. Well, there is a reality that sometimes we do undergo great difficulties, great hardships because of our sin. Now,
the way of the transgressor is hard.
That's right, exactly. I mean, there's no question that there is that kind of cause and effect, and even among Christians, he disciplines the ones whom he loves, and so that kind of causal relationship is sometimes there, but we know it's not always there, because when Jesus is going to heal a man born blind, the question is asked, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus said, it's not. That's not what it is. That's not what this is. This is not because of his sin. It's not because of his parents' sin. It's really ultimately to glorify God. And so I think we have to be very, very careful in assuming that we understand why it is that we're undergoing a particular trial. But having said that, we do have to have a category that says, yeah, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes we endure hardship because of our own sin, but then sometimes we endure hardship for reasons that go far beyond our wisdom or understanding.
Maybe riffing off of your mention of the man born blind in John 9. You say in your article that suffering as a Christian shows the reality of our faith and displays God's power in us. Maybe you could speak to those two things. How does it display how does suffering in our lives display the reality of our faith, and how does it manifest God's power? You know how some Christians would interpret that and say this is a manifestation of God's weakness. Otherwise, he wouldn't let me go through this.
Well, both those things are explicitly stated in the scriptures. In 1 Peter 1, Peter tells these suffering, beleaguered Christians that one of the benefits of their suffering, one of the things that's going on as they suffer, is they are showing the reality of their faith. And it's I think easy for us to understand this as we think about the lives of other people who may have had an influence on us. We have all encountered people who went through unimaginable suffering, unimaginable difficulty, and yet their faith in Christ is intact, it's strengthened. They constantly testify about the goodness of God, and you kind of step back and you say, there's something remarkable about that. This is an extraordinary thing. And at the very least you say, oh, they really mean it, because they couldn't be talking about God's goodness and God's love and God's care, and God's been so kind to them in the midst of this if it wasn't really the case. So that's what I mean when I say it shows the reality of their faith. Peter talks about the proven genuineness of your faith may be showcased. And then in terms of God's power, this is undeniably a real paradox, but I was thinking there of what Paul testifies in 2 Corinthians 12. Remember, Paul had this thorn in the flesh, messenger of Satan, and he pled with the Lord 3 times to have it removed. And the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. But then he goes on to say this, because my power is perfected in weakness. And that is so difficult for us to understand. But the Apostle Paul came to recognize through the Lord's work in his life that actually, and he says this, when I am weak, then I am strong. And I think it's, again, because the Lord delights in showcasing his power in ways that make it clear that it is his power. So often, if we are operating in our own strength, it can be a little unclear sometimes to us, and certainly to others. Is this really the Lord's doing, or is it just that this person has particular gifts? And Paul's thorn in the flesh made it clear that any strength that he had, spiritually speaking, came from the Lord and not from him. That was obvious because of his constant weakness from whatever that thorn in the flesh was. So it's a way of kind of highlighting or spotlighting the fact that it's God's power and not our own.
It strikes me that this is an aspect, perhaps, of Martin Luther's theology of the cross, and even his argument that God sometimes works sub contrario, under the form of the contrary, or counterintuitive, in ways we expected power to not show up in the context of weakness, but rather triumphalism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, he contrasts that with the theology of glory, which is obvious and visual and it clear to everyone. And instead, he said, no, we need is the wisdom that only God can provide to show that the great strength comes through the cross ultimately. And so yeah, I think all of that ties in with what he was trying to say.
Was Paul's thorn in the flesh, do you think, a physical malady or the persecution of some human opponent?
Yeah, I don't
Minister
know.
of Satan, but that still leaves an open question.
Right.
You don't have to answer. That was just an extra.
Well, I don't know, but I will say this, that if it was a human opponent or a human adversary or someone who just was difficult, created difficulties for Paul, I'm not sure why that would explain the perpetual nature of it. Oh, I mean, I suppose there's a way it could. People can still create problems for you even when you're nowhere near them. But it strikes me, and this is just, again, I'm speaking hypothetically, we don't know is the answer. But but it strikes me that whatever it was, it seems to be something that, as it were, traveled with Paul as he went about his life of ministry. But beyond that, I don't know that I can really say with any assurance.
You suggest that suffering and trials are, in the article, more than simply bearable. I think that's not, if I take away your message, the message is just not you can get through, but actually can be a cause for rejoicing. Can you unpack that a little bit? How could they be a cause for rejoicing?
Well, I say that with fear and trepidation because I wouldn't hold myself up as an example of that. Whenever you write about topics like this, you're always very aware. At least I'm always very aware that I'm not an example in this regard. But I think the logic is this, biblically speaking, that if once you recognize that God is in charge of everything in your life, and that nothing happens to you apart from His control, apart from His divine wisdom mapping this all out, then and you couple that with a confidence in God's goodness and His fatherly care, then you realize that actually these things, in some way that perhaps will not even be understandable to me this side of glory, are designed for my ultimate good. And I use the word ultimate good here because I think we have to be careful about giving a facile answer. I'm not saying, I mean, there are many times in our lives where we look back on what was a hard circumstance and we say, okay, I learned a lot from that. I'm glad I went through it. I think that happens to all of us. But we have to acknowledge there are some circumstances where we look back and maybe even will look back on our deathbed and say, you know, for the life of me, I can't understand that. That just seemed like a pointless suffering that I still to this day wish I had never endured. But even in those circumstances, and we do have those circumstances, even in those circumstances, we have to say, yes, but God is sovereign and God is good, and God promises that all things work together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. But we have to say that that's in an ultimate sense, that they work out for our good and for His glory.
Then our faith has to rise above our mood or our sentiments in that respect.
Well, that's right. And I think that's another aspect of the question you asked earlier about the proven genuineness of our faith, to use Peter's phrasing, that the fact that you retain your confidence in God and retain your reliance on God and His mercy and His goodness and His sovereignty in those circumstances is not only a sign to everyone else that this is real, but it strengthens your own faith and it proves it even in a sense it even demonstrates that God is at work in you.
God uses the cross of Christ, the most horrific and unjust suffering in the history of the world, to change us and cause us to grow. In one part of your article, you say that our suffering of believers points to His suffering. How does two things here? How does the suffering of Christ bring about change for the good in us? And then how does our suffering point to His?
Well, the way it produces change in us is by producing what James calls and Paul in Romans 5 calls steadfastness and hope. Paul goes even further and talks about suffering producing endurance. And that, again, that athletic metaphor helps us there. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. And so I think there are at least two aspects. One, we continue to grow and endure and become stronger spiritually as we're forced to suffer. And also our hope is increased because hope has to do with our confidence in the future. And we're banking on the fact that God is at work in our lives and in the world in such a way as to bring about His purposes in the future. And so our hope grows as we continue to trust in Him going through these great difficulties. In terms of the cross, this is the most profound aspect of suffering. So I think most people who think about the the reality of who God is will say that suffering is a mysterious part of our existence. How can in fact, sometimes the question will be posed this way: how, if God really is loving, if God really is good, how can there be this kind of suffering in the world? And it's true that there's so much suffering that is a great mystery to us. Even personally, it remains mysterious to us. But one of the things that I'm struck by when we look at the scriptures is that there's really an even greater mystery, because at the heart of the history of the world and of God's redemptive history is the mystery of the unjust suffering of the righteous one. And so I think when we begin to contemplate the fact that God works in our suffering, and that's a mysterious thing, but even in human history, the mystery at the heart of human history is that a perfectly righteous man, the God man, in fact, is brought to the greatest possible, to endure the greatest possible suffering for the benefit eternally of his people. And so Peter makes this direct connection again in that same letter where he's talking to these suffering Christians, and he says essentially, Christ also suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. And Peter is, as it were, tying in their suffering and the ultimate suffering that points to, of the entirely righteous one, the only entirely fully righteous man who suffers on behalf of the unrighteous.
Well, your answer there anticipated my last question, which was going to be, what is the end of Christian suffering? I think you answered it well. That I think we should say Christian suffering is momentary. And compared to the glory to follow, even regarded as light affliction, even if it costs us our very lives, it's still compared to that glory, light affliction. And that it serves a purpose. It's an instrument, but it's an instrument that will eventually fall away when that work is done. And then the end of suffering is really the end of suffering, when we are in the place of glory where there is no more tears, no more trials, no more ministers of Satan, as it were, creating thorns in our flesh. But that we have that great hope, and Christ's own triumph over his own suffering and death is a harbinger of what awaits us.
I'm so struck by the words that you alluded to, that Paul says, our light momentary affliction, or he says, or in another place he says, the sufferings of this present world are not worth comparing with the glory that is to follow. And when you stop to consider the sufferings of the Apostle Paul, which were many and varied and lengthy, you realize that was not a small thing for him to say. He had endured in ways that most of us will never have to endure. And yet he says, ultimately, that's not even worth comparing with the glory that is to follow. And you're absolutely right. At the end, of course, of the scriptures, we're told that God will wipe away every tear from our eyes, and there will no longer be suffering or crying or pain. And so sometimes when we're caught in the midst of our suffering, it's like if you sit down to watch a movie with someone, and halfway through they say, I don't like this, I don't like where this is going, and you want to say, no, just stay till the end. It'll all make sense at the end. And there's a sense in which the Bible gives us that real confidence on a big scale, that at the end, even if we can't explain it now, and I think many times we shouldn't try to explain it. We see through a glass darkly, Paul says, and the hidden things are of the Lord, we read in Deuteronomy. But while we can't explain those hidden things, and while we do see only partially now, the reality is we know that one day all these things will not only be explained, but they'll be undone, and that there'll be a time of rejoicing when suffering is done away with, because of the work of the suffering servant on our behalf.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for your work on this short but really helpful article. I trust that it would be a real encouragement to many, and we often tout how brief and readable books are that we review, but this one takes the cake because it's just a few hundred words, but really, really well done. And I think will be an encouragement to all. We normally offer a premium that we'll mail out. This premium is guaranteed winners for all because the link will be in the show notes that will take you right to this article, Suffering Matters, by our own host, Jonathan. So thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, James. And I would just like to say to our listeners that if you know someone who might be helped by this or even by the link that we're going to post, please spread the word. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.